Okay, hi everybody, welcome. We're going to hang out on this screen for just a minute while we let everybody get in and get situated. So if you come on in, relax. If you would like to use the chat feature, you can let us know where you're watching from, what facilities you're representing. We're going to hang out here for just a minute though while we let everybody get in. Okay, and it looks like our participant numbers are still climbing, so I am going to hang out here for just another minute. All right, thank you guys for joining us and welcome to ZAA's Professional Development Webinar Series. My name is Kate and I am the chair of the Professional Development Committee. For those of you joining us for the first time, ZAA is the Zoological Association of America. It is a nonprofit, member-based accrediting organization that's dedicated to the responsible wildlife management, conservation, and education. ZAA upholds the highest levels of professional standards in animal welfare, safety, and ethics. We've got some great webinars coming up. We're going to round out May with some more avian webinars. So May 10th will be training for avian species. May 31st will be avian nutrition. And then in June, we discuss reptiles and amphibians. June 7th is husbandry and welfare of ambassador snakes. June 14th is breeding amphibians. And June 24th, we'll be talking about training reptiles. A few reminders for the audience before we begin. You guys will remain muted at all times, but don't worry, there is going to be a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and you'll use the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. If you see a question that you like, give it a thumbs up. That will boost your favorite question to the top of the list where it will be more likely to be asked. And then this and all of our previously recorded webinars are available on the members only page of ZAA.org. We have our upcoming annual conference, October 16th through 20th this year in Providence, Rhode Island. ZAA's annual awards applications are due on July 31st, and you can find those applications at zaa.org/awards. We have coming up on July 31st, the deadline for the conference scholarships. We have the A.J. Higginbottom and the Mickey Olson Education Scholarships. These were created to provide an opportunity for individuals to attend the ZAA annual conference who might not otherwise be able to attend due to financial limitations. So if you'd like to join us in Providence, visit zaa.org/education-scholarships. And on to tonight's presentation. We are discussing USDA bird regulations with an avian specialist from USDA's APHIS Center for Animal Welfare, Dr. Cody Yager. Dr. Yager served as the project leader for the proposed and final regulations and standards, where he's aided in progressing the rule through the federal review system, developed the avian training program for field employees, and partnered with external and internal stakeholders to recognize and address potential impacts of the rule. He earned his DVM at the Virginia-Maryland College of Veterinary Medicine and his master's in public health at Virginia Tech. He has personally owned birds his entire life and shares his home with a 24-year-old blue and gold macaw and a 10-year-old rose-breasted cockatoo. Dr. Yager, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to pull up the presentation here. There we go. Good. Everyone can see that?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Thank you. And hey, thank you everyone for being here and sharing your time with me this afternoon. I'm really excited to share some news about this. I know USDA has been talking about this for almost 20 years or over 20 years now. So I know it kind of felt like, was this ever going to come? Well, that day is here. So I'd like to kind of introduce this and go over some of the timelines about when you need to be licensed and go over the regulations with you today, okay? And let me see if I might have to click one more. There it is. Perfect. And I do have Dr. Ryan Sadler on this. Ryan, are you able to introduce yourself?
Yeah, happy to. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Sadler. I kind of wear two hats, literally and metaphorically. So I'm the senior veterinarian at the Oakland Zoo, and then I also serve as a advisor role here at USDA. I'm on the national policy staff as an avian specialist. So I'll be smiling and backing up Cody, who's the expert on this.
Thanks, Ryan. All right, so timelines. When do you need to get licensed, or if you're already licensed, what do you need to do? So fortunately, if you're already licensed with USDA, there's not a whole lot you need to do with your license. The only thing that will happen is come August 21st, if an inspector shows up at your facility, they're also going to look at your birds. So you will not need to get a new pre-license or another additional inspection just for your birds, or it won't also change your cohort status. So the only time, so when will you add birds to your license? It's when your license expires. So even if you just got renewed to, come July of this year, you won't have birds on that, and the inspector will not be looking at your birds. But once past August 21st, when they go do an inspection at your facility, they will be looking at your birds. And then once in 3 years, once your license expires and you have to renew, then you're going to include birds on that. Okay. So I just want to be very clear that there's if you're already licensed with us, there's nothing you need to do if you're licensed in regards to this new bird rule. Okay. The only thing will change is that inspectors will be looking at your birds come August 21st. Now, if you're not already licensed with us, and because you're needing to get licensed because of the bird rule, you have a year, or up till February of 21st of next year. We do recommend that you apply at least 90 days before you want to do covered activity after February. So if you're going to need to be able to do covered activity come February 21st, I would recommend that you put in your application November of this year with us. The first thing I want to do is point you to our website. The whole team and I have spent a lot of time getting some great documents up there and knowledge to kind of help prepare everyone for this. There is the web address down below, but all you need to do is just Google USDA bird rule, and it will be the first hit that pops up. Okay. So on that page, when you click on that, you're going to see a timeline as well as 4 videos. Those 4 videos will kind of give you an introduction, very similar to this, that goes over deadlines and timing and when you need to apply and all that. The second one will go on who needs to be licensed or registered. It will go over the thresholds. The third one will be a video that will walk you through how to apply. And then the last one, which is a very important one, it's about 45 minutes long, but it will walk you through the new avian regulations. It's geared towards kind of preparing you for a pre-license, but even if you're already licensed with us and won't need to go through that pre-license process, it still be really advantageous for you guys to look through and watch. And it is time stamped too. So if you want to skip ahead into different sections, you can do that. And I believe the script is actually on there too. So if you want to print off and distribute to some of your curators at your facilities, you can do that as well. We put a lot of time into that, and it really goes section by section of the regs to kind of give you much background on that. Okay. Also on that website is the regs themselves. There is a link for the CFR, electronic CFR. So you can actually click on that, look it online, and you can actually do a PDF on the side of it, and it will give you a really nice little handout. I have a copy of it, kind of looks like this. And sorry, it's a little blurred because of that, but it will be a nice little 16-page print off of the regulations, the avian regulations, subpart G, that you can print off and then distribute at your zoo. Also on that website is the definition of a pet bird, all the different species groups, and then we do have an FAQ up there as well. It's kind of gone over the top 10 questions we've been getting. We're going to probably update that in the next coming weeks to add a couple more, because as you can imagine, we've been getting some questions. So, and now we feel like we've got some good repeat questions that we probably need to put up there. So I really if there's nothing else you get out of this presentation, please look that up, go through some of those videos, especially that last one, because it will pretty much walk you through the regs and get you everything you need to know to be prepared. I also wanted to say a little bit on this is, you know, I don't know how, depending on how large your facility is, the bird curators, the bird sections may be a little bit more separated from mammalian. And so I really would encourage you, if that's the case, if you for larger facilities, that you talk to your mammal counterparts, okay? Because they've gone through USDA inspections. And maybe you can actually go along with one of the, if there is a USDA inspection that's happening over this summer, maybe you can go along with that and just see it. A lot of the language and standards that we see in subpart G for avian species are very similar to the other subparts. And so we'll give you a good idea of, okay, what does adequate cleaning look like? What does that mean? And you could talk to the inspector and see that. So I'd recommend that you do talk to your counterparts. And also, like, there is the enrichment plan that's going to be required for birds. It's almost identical to the same requirements for non-human primates. So if you're confused and you're not sure about exactly what you need, we do have an example of a form for non-human primate enrichment. We are working one for birds as well. It's right now being approved and has to go through OMB approval. It's taking a little bit longer than we thought, but we will have a form for you. But I would recommend, if you have non-human primates at your facility, you have to already have that enrichment plan for those animals. So go ahead and talk to the curators in charge of that, and they'll know exactly what you're talking about and be able to help you with that. As well as, of course, reaching out to me, your inspector, or anyone else in USDA. So I want to quickly go over the thresholds for licensures when it comes to exhibiting. I know most of you on this call probably are above this and will need to be licensed or are currently licensed, but I'll just want to quickly go over the thresholds. If you're exhibiting more than 8 pet animals, and that is including pet birds, I talked a little bit about on our website, we had those lists of pet bird species on there. But if those birds are not included on that pet bird species, unless it's a raptor, if you're exhibiting 1 penguin, 1 flamingo, 1 swan, then you're going to need a license. We also gave an exemption of a threshold for raptors. We really thought those facilities that are exhibiting 4 or fewer raptors, mostly for rehabilitation work, that they are already, currently permitted through Fish and Wildlife, and they're much smaller facilities that they didn't meet the de minimis. So if you have a facility that is just exhibiting 4 or fewer raptors, you would not need a license. So then, in summary, exhibiting any non-pet bird species or more than 4 raptors, that would require a license. All right, so I'm going to kind of do a quick, around the world overview of the regulations. And this is kind of, if you want more in depth, I would encourage you to look at that 4th video on our website, which I will talk about each one of these sections in much more in detail. So the first section is 3.150, very similar to the other subparts, how this is laid out. This is your general facility regulations. This talks about the upkeep of the grounds. It also talks about making sure that, if you do have avian species that wander the property, that they free range the grounds, that's perfectly fine, but they must have access to some type of safety area or their primary enclosure when they're not being monitored. And what does that mean? It's really, if it's kind of like overnight where no one's actually at the facility, or say everyone is a smaller facility and everyone takes a 2-hour, lunch break, that's we're going to consider not being monitored. Okay. It's really is someone around the grounds making sure, like, if a predator were to breach, the primary enclosure and go after them, someone would intervene, or if there's inclement weather that's coming on, that you can get the birds into safety. So as long as you're kind of like monitoring the overall safety of the birds and someone's around there, it doesn't mean that they need to be in front of the primary enclosure watching the bird directly, but just kind of around the facility grounds. Okay. The next section talks about the actual indoor versus outdoor requirements. There's not a whole lot here. And as you'll see, there's hardly any engineered standards in these regulations, meaning there is really hardly any numbers. So we don't say, hey, for your emperor penguins, you need to keep it between this temperature ranges, okay? We fall back on saying, what are professional standards? What are, things that have been published for? And ultimately, we're looking at the bird. This is very performance-based, as you'll hear, is how's the bird looking? If it seems like it's adapted well to the climate that you're providing, we're going to be okay with it, okay? So 3.15 goes in the indoor, and then 3.152 goes over outdoor. And it's just over the, making sure that temperature and humidity ranges are appropriate for those animals. And then making sure for outdoor enclosures, you do provide shelter, okay? And let me spend a little time on shelter because I know this is a common question. What about those open top duck ponds that we're not talking about wild ducks? We're talking about a facility owns these ducks and it's in an open air pond. There should be some type of, the animals cannot just wander outside of the zoo grounds, right? They need to be be able to be kept in the zoo grounds. It's fine. It doesn't have to be like in a cage or anything, but it just needs to be some way that the animals are kept on zoo grounds. They're not crossing the street and going into the neighborhood down the road kind of thing, okay? And for shelter for that, it can be both, man-made structures or natural structures. So if you do have, say tall grass or reeds in the water for your ducks where, if a hailstorm came or a windstorm or something, or they have enough shade that all the ducks have access to it, that's perfectly fine. We're not requiring you that you have to have a man-made structure for these. But if they're put into an area that doesn't have access to shade, then you're going to need some type of, man-made structure, okay? In 3.153, that talks specifically about the primary enclosure, the actual, environment that animals are held into. And it's, this is one of the longer, probably the largest of these sections, but it talks about from tethering, about making sure that the birds are contained there. If there's no sharp edges, very similar stuff that you'll see in the other subparts, okay? And then we also talk about spacing in there. And so I know that's a common question about spacing. Again, we have no engineered standards for space. You're not going to see, hey, for storks, you're going to provide this much a square feet. We use the same kind of standard as subpart F or for all other mammals where it's performance based. Is the animal able to turn around, make normal posture adjustments? We don't say that there has to be enough space to fly, but we do also say that, hey, your attending vet must be consulted about space. Now, another question about that usually we hear about is, well, does that need to be documented? No, it doesn't. We just say, hey, you need to, when you're talking to your attending vet, if they're part-time, when they come do the visit, that they go and they've gone around the enclosures, they looked and said, okay, this looks like normal space for your avian species. We're not requiring that's documented. If the inspector had concerns, they may visit with your attending vet and verify that, but we're not saying that you have to have anything written down for that, okay? Next is the environmental enhancement plan that I talked about, the enrichment plan. This is in 3.154. It basically it requires that if you do have avian species, that you have some type of enrichment plan that is put in place that helps for the psychological well-being of your animals, okay? It does have a little bit of specifics if your bird is experiencing some type of psychological distress, such as feather picking, that you may need to do additional enrichment to meet that. But we are saying that you have to, one, provide enrichment for all avian species. And when I say make sure to put that in there, don't get too prescriptive, okay? So don't write in there, hey, on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m., I'm going to give 2 tablespoons of Jif peanut butter to all avian species, because if the inspector comes there, inspects and say, oh yeah, we didn't do 2, we actually did 3 one day, that would be a non-compliance. And so what I would say is, you'd say, hey, on 2 to 3 days a week, we do some type of food enrichment, and along with we do X amount for human interaction, and then some type of, we enrich the environment with XYZ, with toys or natural brush or some other enrichment device. So just kind of make sure you build a little flexibility, don't get too prescriptive in that. Again, like I said, talk to your non-human primate folks. They've already been doing this for years and they've got it down. Next is the 3.155 to 3.15 through 7. This goes over your feeding, water, and water quality. Again, very performance-based. Are you providing the feed and watering, and the water is a quality that meets industry standards? It's not making the birds sick. Is this adequate for your birds? Okay. Next is the cleaning and sanitization, the 3.158. We don't have a specific frequency requirement. We just say you need to be doing enough cleaning and sanitization that is keeping the animal and the cage itself fairly clean. We don't say like, oh, you can only have 42 droppings, but 43 is, oh, that's no go. No, we're looking at the animal. Is the animal's environment clean? Is the animal itself clean? Okay. Is it attracting pests? Those are the kinds of things we're looking at. We do allow, and this is the only subpart that we allow this, but we do allow you to delay this during nesting. And we say that you just have to have it written down. When is the breeding season, when it was last cleaned, and when do you expect it to return, when you'll be able to clean, okay? The next 3.159 is employees, the very short regulation. It just says that you need to have enough trained employees to meet the animal's husbandry needs. Next to last, compatibility and separation. This is saying is, hey, are the birds or other animals that you may be housing with them, are they compatible? Are they causing interspecific aggression? How are you dealing with that? That's, that needs to be, that the birds need to be held with compatible species or other animals, okay? And then lastly is the transportation regs. There are a few engineered standards, especially around ventilation in there, but that's about the only, engineered standards on there, and it's the same as with other subparts, the other species groups. I also want to point to you 4 other areas of the regulations that do impact birds. The first and most important is the vet care for birds, 2.40. This is exact same identical regulations for all the other subparts. This is saying if you don't have a full-time vet, if you have a part-time, you have a program of vet care written down, that you give your vet the authority to be able to say if he or she wants to do, XYZ, that you follow their direction, and that you have daily observation of your birds, and that you're reporting those medical concerns to your attending vet in a timely manner. We also have ID requirements in 2.5E. For ID requirements, we're saying, if you have them on your paperwork, so if they're written down saying, okay, this is the bird, the number, the species, that will serve for ID. The only time that we require like cage identification is during in transport. Then we say that you can identify either by a wing or leg band, by microchip, or by a cage card. Okay, and that cage card usually needs to have the species, the number of birds, and any distinguishing marks if there are any, or features. Next is 2.75B1 records. Again, these are the same requirements for your exotic mammal species as well. So if you have questions about them, talk to them, because they've been doing this. And it's really writing down what birds, when a bird comes or leaves onto your property, when did it arrive, what approximate age of it on that. a common question I've gotten about this is, well, hey, we got this bird like 30 years ago. We don't remember really the age of it or who we got it from or where it came. That's fine. You guys, the bird was not being regulated back then. So just starting now, if you were already licensed with us, starting August 21st, make sure to record that information when you're having new additions come onto your property or leaving. And then lastly is the contingency planning that went into effect last year. It'll be the same. You don't have to write a new one unless for some reason there is new risks associated by having birds, new, first, depending on your facility, if there's, new concerns about that, then you may want to update that, but it's the same contingency planning as for the mammals. We'll go into questions next, but I did want to just say this is how to reach us. This is our mailing address. It's our primary number, 970-494-7478. If you want to be able to talk to somebody, that will go to our Fort Collins office. I have already talked to them, gotten some of their questions that they've been, so they should be able to answer some. If for some reason they don't have the answer, they're going to most likely direct them to either me or Ryan or someone else on the team. Same with an email address. My screen just went black, but it was animalcare@usda.gov was the email if you want to email. Are you guys still seeing the slide, or it just shows black to me?
No,
Yeah,
we just see black.
I just see black. Could you go back one slide maybe so we can keep that?
Okay.
There it is.
There we go.
So I saved the IT issues at the very end for you guys. So, but yeah, that email address was animalcare@usda.gov. If you want to put that. Lastly, I know that your initial tendency is going to want to reach out to your inspector, and that's perfectly fine. I'm not saying not to do that. Will just say we are still in the process of training them on the regulations. Okay, so we've been talking to them and training them for the last 2+ years on avian biology, on the industry, on all the various IDs and all that, but we were not able to until we had the rule published back in February this year. We could not train on that because we didn't know if that would be the final. Now that we know it's the final, it's written in stone. Now we're training the inspectors on the regulations as we speak. So most likely you're probably not going to be able, they're not going to be able to answer you on that, and they're going to redirect you to me. And so that's fine too. And I think it's good to loop them in the process, because I really do want your inspector involved with what questions you have so they can see it, so we're all on the same page. Because I know there's that, okay, Cody said this, but my inspector's telling me this. That's the last thing I want to happen, okay? Because that doesn't make anyone happy, okay? I want, and so does everyone in USDA, wants you guys to be successful, because it makes our jobs easier, and it means that you guys are taking care of the animals, okay? So if that does happen, that you have some concerns, feel free to reach out to me. I am the avian field specialist, so I'm the one going with inspectors in the fields when they are having issues. So you may see me at one of your facilities, but please reach out. This is a learning time, not just for you guys, but for us too, right? It's probably been 30 years since we put out a new subpart. And so this is a huge change. And so we're learning an entire new, animal area here. And we need to learn from you guys too. We have the regulations. There's multiple times it talks about industry standards, and that's what you guys do. So just as well that you guys, want to hear from us, we want to hear from you and be able to have a very collaborative, relationship in this. Okay. So I think that's it for me. I know we have some questions, right?
We definitely have a lot of questions. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative, and we do have a lot of questions. We are going to try to get to every question, but we have about 30 minutes left. So again, if you want to put your questions in the Q&A, if you see a question that's been asked that you like, give it an upvote with a thumbs up. That'll move it to the top of the list. And Dr. Yager, our first question, just for clarification purposes, do we need to add birds to our current permits?
Nope, you will not. You will not need to add birds to your permit once your license expires. And if it expires after August 21st, then once you renew, then you'll add birds to your license then.
So if I just got inspected for my 3-year license, I do not need to worry about it adding them for 3 years, but they will be inspected.
Correct.
Perfect.
Okay, next question is, the regulations state that flight restricted and non-flighted free roaming birds must have access to a safety pen, enclosure, or other area that offers protection overnight or when not being monitored. I think you hit on this a couple times, but what is when not being monitored? Does that mean that, an attendant has to be with the birds at all times, or, what happens in the evening when no one is at the facility or the zoo?
Yeah, this is a common question. So it does not mean you need to be standing in front of the enclosure. It just means our employees around. Like I said, most of the time it's going to be, especially for the larger facilities, it's going to be those off hours when everyone's home and everyone's kind of locked up and there's no one walking the grounds. Or for smaller facilities, if there is a 2-hour lunch break and everyone leaves. It's really, is there someone around? If there's a weather event that can intervene, or there's some type of predator that comes on, kind of that's the whole intent of that.
Okay, and can you explain compliance for the larger pasture birds, which are generally ratites, ostriches, emu, rhea, things like that? Are they required to be locked in every night, or what does compliance look like for that?
Great question. So they don't need to be locked up in like a shed barn or anything like that. They can still be on their pasture as long as there's some type of fencing, right? Keeping them in that pasture. Again, they can't be crossing the street and go visiting the neighbors down the road. Okay. It's confined in some type of, outdoor pasture enclosure. That's what we would call. For shelter for those, again, it's kind of like I talked about the ducks. As long as there's enough adequate shelter, natural, for trees and tall brush that would protect them from the elements, then you wouldn't need to provide a man-made structure. But if they're on a grass pasture with no really overhanging vegetation to protect them from the elements, then that's when you would probably need some type of shelter for the animals to get into if there's a windstorm, hail, or something like that. Again, I know that can be a little bit subjectivity there. If you have questions, that's when you could email me, your inspector, and say, okay, we're debating about whether we need to build a shelter for these ostriches. Here's some of the landscape, what it looks like. Do you think this is adequate? And again, just like in the regulations, we're going to look at, is there enough in there that it's going to protect the animal from wind, rain, sun, any precipitation. And it's kind of within what the natural state of the animal too. Ryan, go ahead.
And remember, a lot of these are performance based. So if you're losing some of your free roaming, peafowl or things like that are exhibit animals to coyotes or other predators, then that would be described as inadequate shelter for them. And so that's where, the performance-based component comes in.
Great point, Ryan. And we have also in that general housing that it does protect the animals from animals negatively impacting the welfare of your animals. So this doesn't mean, and this is another common question we get, well, what happens if the sparrows come and land in the flamingo enclosure? No, that's fine. We understand that's going to happen. We're talking about animals that would negatively impact those animals. Okay, so the hawks coming in and predating your flamingos, that's a different story.
Okay, great. The next question is going to be about walk-through aviaries. Do walk-through aviaries which allow feeding of birds now require an attendant, like budgie feeding aviaries?
Great question. So the handling regs, which is 2.131, it's the same for birds and it applies in the same manner. So if you are doing the same activity, feeding of mammals, it would need a attendant. And so if you're going to do those type of activities where you're having, the seed stick, or for like the lorries, the nectar, where you're, the public is interacting with the animal and you're, promoting that interaction, then yes, you would need to have an attendant. Now, what about those walking through aviaries that you don't have that activity? What we're going to do is we're looking to see if are you promoting the interaction of those animals or not. And if you're, by what that looks like to us about not promoting is you have signs that say, hey, don't touch the birds. Don't go off the pathway. There should be some type of defined pathway, or you're having someone not necessarily monitoring them, but someone walking around, making sure that, Sally the flamingo, who really likes people, especially certain times of the year, isn't going in directly, chasing people or looking for handouts. Or if that activity, that behavior is there, that you discourage it, or maybe Sally shouldn't be in that walk-in aviary. So we're really going to be looking at, are you trying to promote the interaction or discourage it? If you're trying to promote an interaction, then yes, you're going to need to have an attendant there.
Okay. And we are getting a lot of questions about the ID requirements. Specifically, I think a lot of these questions are involving free flight aviaries. Is there a need to band or ID each individual bird on property? And what does compliance for that look like?
So great question. So when I talked about microchipping, wing banding, or cage guard, it's only for those birds in transport. So they're coming to your property or leaving your property. For those birds that are on exhibit, if you just have them in your paperwork where you say, okay, there is, 14 lorries or whatever, and you may not even know the gender of them, that's fine. They came on this day, and if one of them died, you would have a death, date on that. You do not have to, there's no requirement for you to be banding all those birds, microchipping them while they're being exhibited in their primary enclosure. I want to make very clear about that because I know that's, and you can go, that fourth video talks about that too. It's just for in transport. We interpret this the exact same way with mammals. So if you're still confused about this, talk to your mammal counterparts because it's the exact same way. As long as it's on the inventory records, that's all you need to have. You do not need to be IDing individually those animals.
Okay.
Next question. I hope there's like a big sigh of relief I just heard in the audience. I'm just going to imagine that.
Oh, there's so many more questions, Dr. Yager. When the inspectors come, will they go into the bird enclosures for inspection with the bird? This person says, I know our current inspector does with our education possums, which is not a big deal, but it seems like it would be much more stressful to most of the birds in our collection.
Great question. So what we tell inspectors, right? I'm training the inspectors. We say there's no reason that you ever need to touch a bird, okay? And for biosecurity reasons, it's very important that you try not to go in the enclosure. Force those enclosures that are designed for the public to walk through. Of course, we're going to be walking through that. But if you have concerns, the last thing we want to do is negatively impact welfare, right? That's the exact opposite of our job. And so if you have concerns that say, hey, these subset of birds, we're really concerned, they're either breeding or they're going through XYZ, we do not really want, and someone going in the enclosure, have that conversation, okay? I think the inspector will say, okay, well, that's fine. Tell me how you're doing daily ops. is there a way for me to view the birds without being in the enclosure? We are supplying all the inspectors with binoculars, how just have that conversation with the inspector so that they feel like they can get the required information without having to go into an enclosure. Okay. Ryan, did you have anything else to add to that, or?
No, yeah, what I would just say is knowing that there's going to be sensitive species, so certain pigeon species that would spook and, go towards the ceiling if they were to enter their primary enclosure, have an idea on how you would approach that with the inspector beforehand, so you don't have to troubleshoot it the day of. So say, hey, we're able to get a good look at the bird and the habitat from the walkway that the public uses, that sort of thing. So troubleshooting those beforehand can save you some time on the inspection date.
And remember, this is not new to the inspectors. There's a lot of hoof stop that get very startled easily. And so they have to do the same type of strategies. So this is not new to us. Okay.
Excellent. What type of documentation, if any, is going to be required for singly housed social species that may be housed separately due to medical issues or behavioral issues?
Ryan, do you want to take this one, or?
Sure, and correct me if I'm wrong, Cody, but I think it's just it needs to be with consultation with the AV, and if there's a medical issue, then it needs to be documented in that animal's medical record on why. You don't need to necessarily every time that that animal is moved or something like that, need to document it over, but just say we have this, parrot that has inappropriate interactions with its supposed mate, or raiding on another bird to arrive. We've housed them separately so that they don't cause trauma to each other. That's noted in the medical record, that sort of thing. Cody, do you have anything to chime in on that one?
No, that's exactly like we're gonna look at, is it for medical reasons, or is it because you simply don't have another compatible animal to house with that? And then we're going to talk to your attending vet if we feel like we need to, just to verify things. But we also do say that does fall under a special requirement that you will have then provide additional enrichment. So if you do have a bird that you cannot have, a social species of birds that you cannot provide for that social aspect to meet its needs, then how are you providing additional enrichment than what you would normally do? So do you, play those, or is there maybe one more interaction one-on-one with the handler, with the caretaker, or do you provide additional other types of enrichment? It does fall under one of those additional enrichment requirements.
Okay, the next question is, are there restrictions on free flight bird presentations? If so, how are free flight bird presentations to operate in compliance with the restrictions?
Yeah, this is an interesting one, and we've been kind of going back and forth a little bit, and we're still struggling a little bit about this, because in one way it's extremely beneficial for the animal, right? This is the animal gets to do what it normally does in free flies, and we're not saying that you can't do that. Absolutely, I think that's great. We have some facilities that'll do these free flight shows where they allow their raptors to go several miles around the facility. Now, I will say that those birds are being monitored, though, right? They have some type of telemetry on them, so they know where the birds are, and they can recall the birds. And it's not just something they just say, hey, we're going to see if this works. There is lots of months and months of training that goes involved to allow that happen. Now, there is going to be somewhat of a concern, because it does happen where, hey, you do this free flight and then the bird flies away and doesn't get recovered, or gets recovered days and days later. That's going to be, we're still trying to figure that one out. And honestly, I would love to get some feedback from you all, because that's it. We know if the bird doesn't get recovered, that's going to be a non-compliance, right? But what happens if the bird flies, it goes in the tree, and it's just there overnight, and you recover it the next day? If someone's sitting there looking for, right there, watching the bird overnight, then maybe that's really less likely to be a non-compliance. Or maybe it's something that you build that into your contingency plan so that you do have some type of food or water station that's high up. So if a bird's, does leave the free flight show for a period of time, they have access to it. That's something, but to get back to your question, you can still do your free flight shows, and even if it's, several miles in the sky, as you should be able to monitor that bird should be trained. But do realize there is a risk there that if the bird leaves the property and is gone for a period of time, that could be potentially a non-compliance.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that answer. We have our next question about fencing requirements, specifically for ratites. Are there any defined caging requirements for any species?
Great question. And nope. There is not a single engineered standard when it comes to cage sizing on that. So for any bird.
Oh, all right. Another person says they own an animal training business. They do not have birds on exhibit, but they do live stream training, has a service, and have in-house training workshops. Does this person still need to be licensed and compliant?
So depending on the threshold, so depending on how many birds and what type of bird they may, but we would count that as exhibiting. If you're doing some type of business, even if it's online, but you're doing some type of business that you're getting compensated for that. And so we have, TikTok stars that, where they have their birds or their other mammals that would that do get a license because they're getting compensated for that exhibition. Now, if they have 8 or fewer pet bird species, then they would fall under the threshold, or 4 or fewer raptors, they would fall under the threshold.
But if they have a non-pet bird species that they're exhibiting, then that would be that they would need to be licensed. And then if they were also, say, breeding on the side for the weight requirements, and then or brokering them as an additional part of their business, they still may require to be licensed or registered.
Yep.
That's an excellent clarification question. I have one other clarification question. Are there any species of birds that are exempt from this new regulation?
No, there's no. So how the Animal Welfare Act is based on the animal. So we're talking about birds. There's no like, hey, flamingos are exempt. And then we go in conjunction with the type of activity. Are you exhibiting them? Are you breeding and selling those? Are you doing research? So the only activity that's exempt is falconry, okay, for birds or ag animal purposes, or if your own personal pet use. But if you're exhibiting them, then that would require a license if it goes above those thresholds.
For birds of prey like barn owls, are the requirements for indoor housing, shade structures, shelter boxes acceptable? And again, this is specific to birds of prey.
Yeah, there's no special requirements for birds of prey for the indoor housing. And they're
the shelter requirement is very broad, but again, this is where performance-based comes in. So if there's no requirement for a certain type of perching, but if you have frequent pododermatitis in your birds and that's coming up during your inspection, that may be considered inadequate housing for that species. Similarly, for your birds that you're housing on exhibit, if you lost 3 in a hailstorm, multiple times a year, then that would be a non-compliance because you're not providing adequate shelter.
And like, say you have a mew that you kind of house your raptors in, we don't say like you must have electricity for that, but if you need heating, depending on where you are in the country for that bird, then you must have electricity for that, okay?
Very good. Are there any restrictions or any compliance issues you can foresee on hand rearing of any avian species?
That's a good question.
I can answer that one, Cody.
Yeah.
There isn't a specific restriction based on hand rearing. The same other rules apply in terms of adequate housing, adequate nutrition, that sort of thing. So a lot of it has to deal with storage and that sort of thing. The one thing we do have is in the transport regs for unweaned animals. Those do need to be in consultation with the attending veterinarian. Not necessarily that you can't transport unweaned animals, but that it just needs to be done with consultation with the attending veterinarian, because we all know that's how some of these chicks will get around. Eggs sometimes are transported, and so we just want to make sure that that's in accordance with the program of veterinary care.
And I do want to add, so when does a bird become a bird is when it's externally pipping. So when that beak breaks the shell, or if for some reason you guys need to intervene and break that shell, that outer shell, then that's when it's a covered animal if it's for covered purposes. So anything you guys do with eggs, inspectors will be looking at them. It's not a covered activity. Okay, it's not considered an animal.
Okay, the next question is, could you repeat the information on the IDs for animals in a collection? This person has a particular question about cage inventory on the structure, or would you need it to be just in the records?
So should they ask you about the cage specifications, like the sizing?
I
No.
believe it's
Or identification.
So the identification, when I said cage card, that's again just for transport. Okay, so if we're talking about primary enclosures at your zoo, at your facility there, then as long as it's in the paper, as long as it's in the paperwork where it says, hey, the species, the number, when the bird arrived, or, you know, when it was acquired, or if the hatch date, and then if it died or left the property, that's what it's included. Again, I would encourage you to look at that video that kind of goes over those ID requirements. And it's, like I said, same as mammals. So.
Excellent. Another clarification question on barrier types. Are there required barrier distances for visitors in non-walkthrough type habitats?
So there's no engineered standard. It's performance based. So it goes back to 2.131 that talks about, hey, it needs to be a sufficient distance to keep both the animal and the public safe. Okay. So that's something that I would, if I was in charge of a facility, I would look at, okay, what type of animals are here? And then are they known to be trying to interact with the public? And what kind of damage could they do, and do an assessment of that. But there's no set, like, okay, X amount of feet needs to be behind that the handrail.
All right, I guess the next question would be, we have nesting endangered birds. Does it need to be in the veterinary plan of care or listed elsewhere that we will not be cleaning the boxes until they have fledged?
So it doesn't have to be in the actual program of vet care, but you do need to have it written down. So, and we are hopefully talking about exhibiting birds. So this is, I know some facilities will have their own breeding, you know, that's off-site, not open to the public. We're not talking about that. That wouldn't necessarily be covered. But if you do or you're exhibiting these, you know, birds that are, you know, fractious, and you delay cleaning for that reason, then we just say that you need to have it written down. When is the normal breeding season, when they were last cleaned, and when you're expecting to start cleaning again. You can put it in the program of vet care, but it doesn't have to be in there. It just needs to be written down.
Okay. Does waterfowl interacting in a group together in expansive natural water environments, so these open air pond situations, do they need specific enrichment plans? So I'm assuming this person means flocks of animals that are already housed together in open air situations.
Right. As long as we're talking about covered birds, not wild birds, right? If this
Right.
is the facility owns these, yes, they need to be included on an enrichment program. All of them do, all avian species.
That
Right?
program for that particular species in that particular habitat may be as simple as maintain the natural environment that they are in, with horticulture department or something along those lines. It doesn't necessarily need to be more expansive than that if that's meeting the environmental enrichment needs of that species. But they shouldn't just have no plan whatsoever. They can just identify what they've already provided to the birds and plan on maintaining.
And it could be as simple too as interacting with the public. If say they feed them or do something like that, that can also be, And just like I said before, don't get too prescriptive, give yourself some flexibility. And like Ryan said, it's ultimately performance-based. How's the birds doing? Do they need more or less, or is what you're already meeting their needs?
Okay, are there any regulations on the type of equipment used to keep birds from flying or being released from an open top enclosure while on exhibit? For example, the use of brailing.
No, there isn't any particular restrictions in terms of pinioning. There is, and Cody, you can talk about that a little bit in terms of amount of time being tethered or something like that, especially when we're talking about birds that are part of a training program, that sort of thing. But there aren't any prescriptions on how you keep these birds in their primary enclosure. But there are, welfare impacts that we're all aware on various methods. And so those need to be taken into account by your individual institution. But there's not any prescriptions on deflighting or anything like that. It's again performance-based. If you constantly have birds flying away, then you're probably not too effective in your current control measures.
Yeah, and for tethering, this is one of those areas that we talk about in the regulations. It's going to be based on professional standards, but it's something that, hey, if you're going to be tethering a bird, it has to have appropriate equipment. It can't entangle the birds. The birds must be able to fully extend their wings. And I think we would be strongly looking at, which I don't consider industry standards, would be like tethering a bird for multiple days. That would be something that I would not think that would be a normal industry standard. So we would definitely have some questions if we saw that. And then for the deflighting, I mean, that is ultimately going to be a medical decision based on your attending vet, right? And so it depends on if your attending vet thinks it's appropriate and how and when it should be done. But as long as you're following your attending vet's, direction on that, it will be compliant.
Great, thank you. Do you have any information on the range of fees for non-compliance?
Not my department, and I hate to pull that card, but that is that's our enforcement folks. My understanding is it can be up to $10,000, is it? But there's a host of factors, and I really, you guys are on this call, you're asking great questions. Those folks on here, those folks that are, I highly doubt we'd be having those discussions about, right? You guys are well in front of that. It's the people that don't want to hear this and get preparing for it. So, but my understanding is it's up to $10,000, but please don't quote me on that because there's a host of things that can get factored into that. So
no, that is no problem. Thank you for answering all of our questions tonight. We are at the time where we need to wrap up. This has been an extremely informative webinar. For those of you that are on, we will be providing a follow-up email with a copy of this recorded webinar and also some links that have been mentioned in the webinar to resources for you. So look for that email to come sometime in the next day or two, but you will get that. And please feel free to share this with any of your counterparts so that if they can be just as informed as you are on the USDA regulations. Dr. Yager, Dr. Sadler, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see everybody next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern time. Have a nice night.
take care, guys.
Thank you.
everyone.
You.
Bye.